Talk Show.
Recorded live.
These are provisions, broadly and specifically with regards to infrastructure, that Republicans have traditionally supported broadly.
I suspect that one of the really big surges in the market for housing going forward is going to be the immigrant population.
But I don't, as a president, have the authority to go, if our national security is threatened, then you do it properly.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
This is how liberty dies. By thunderous applause.
Welcome to Liberty Cap Talk Live. This is your host, Todd Andrew Barnett, and his co-host, James Landreth Jr.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to a special episode of Liberty Cap Talk Live. We are on the air, and I want to thank my listeners for tuning in right now. I just posted on my Facebook wall that we're doing this very special episode with a very special guest of ours, and he's going to be joining us in a second here. But I just want to remind my listeners to wear your Liberty caps for the special episode. We're fighting the Republicans and Democrats tooth and nail all the time, every day, no excuses. Okay, we are going to be doing a very interesting episode today, and right now I will bring him on the air as it is. He is probably one of the most prominent voices in the gun rights movement. He's probably one of the most interesting people. He hosts his own radio show, and he is, believe it or not, he's the executive director of Gun Owners of America, and he's a very, very well-educated individual all the way around. Please welcome our very good friend, Larry Pratt. Larry, you with us?
I am indeed. Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, no problem. I just wanted to let you know that if there are any people who are going to be calling in, and if they have any questions for Larry, they're more than welcome to call in and ask their questions, but try to keep it as brief as possible because an hour long can actually go by pretty fast. So having said all that, Larry, I just wanted to ask you, for those who are not familiar with your work in the gun rights movement and the liberty movement, tell us, how did you come into the ideas of liberty as well as the Second Amendment?
Well, I was something that you'd have to say was a mistake. The liberal university, but then I repeat myself, the university that I attended, I was doing graduate studies, and it occurred to me that the professors were full of it, that what had appeared to be deep conflicts between the realist and the idealist in foreign policy, whenever there was an actual down-to-earth situation such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I was in graduate school during that time, the professors all had the same recommendation for foreign policy, recommendation for how the United States should respond to the Soviet missiles in Cuba, and that is we should just take a deep breath and recognize that Cuba is a sovereign nation and they can do what they want, and and I thought, something wrong here with this program, and when I saw them all lining up with the same policy recommendation, whereas the day before they were at each other's throats, cat and dog sort of thing, and I thought, I've been duped. This was a show. This wasn't the real deal. What they actually were saying is the United States isn't worth defending. And so when we see people like the president share that same view, this is where he gets it. When you go to a university, and there are only very few exceptions, you're going to get presented a worldview that says the United States is a bunch of thieves. The only way that we're wealthy is because we've stolen it from other people. And if somebody is unhappy with the United States, like Fidel Castro or Chavez, well, we've really been pretty nasty ourselves in the world community, and we have it coming. Well, that I think is going to be rejected this November. I think we're seeing it be rejected already in primaries where not always, but very, very much almost always, voters are choosing the more conservative of the candidates available, the most Tea Party friendly, the most pro-Second Amendment, and so forth. And that tells me that we're on track, if this continues, for a blowout. And blowing out means blowing out the socialists, otherwise known as Democrats, that are here in the Washington area ruling this country unconstitutionally. We're about to take things back. Now, I don't think we're going to have, probably not, enough to completely get rid of somebody like Speaker Boehner. My preference would be to have a new speaker by the name of Darrell Issa, the congressman that, over Boehner's objections, carried out the hearings on Fast and Furious and got the contempt of Congress citation against Boehner's wishes. And now the House lawyers are actually preparing to go to federal court to instigate a prosecution against the Attorney General for his refusal to turn over documents. So there are people with a backbone, and having seen Darrell Issa in action as a committee chairman, I'm convinced that he can run a meeting, he could run the Congress, he's got the backbone to select a target and move toward it. He just doesn't seem to be deflected by any opposition. Once he seems to have decided that something has to be done, he's going to do it. This guy is enormously successful in real life. He, on his own, made $300 million plus dollars, and when I've seen him at the hearings, even though he's not an attorney, his mind seems to have absorbed that kind of training, and he asked excellent questions and reflected his command of the subject matter of the hearings. So there are some good things happening, and he's among them.
Well, I find that a lot of the Republicans, particularly the conservative Republicans, and speaking as a libertarian myself and not as a conservative, but I've noticed that a lot of conservative Republicans who tend to favor the Second Amendment, unfortunately, are not as consistent on that standpoint as they had been in the past. Like for instance, you've got Mitt Romney, whose record on the Second Amendment has been pretty abysmal, not very well, and this is a very big concern that I think that's going to shake up the conservatives, as far as I'm concerned. At least Ron Paul, whom I was supporting, before it became pretty apparent that Mitt Romney was going to get the nomination in Tampa, Florida, at the Republican National Convention. At least he was consistently defending the Second Amendment, whereas a number of Republicans in the House and Senate, well, some of them were pretty decent on a lot of stuff, but they weren't really that good on the Second Amendment, and they really were, saying outlandish things like, well, we believe in the Second Amendment for all Americans, but exclude everybody else, throughout the whole world. I mean, if you're going to go in favor of gun rights, I think gun rights should apply to everybody across the globe and not just here in the U.S.
You bet.
But
we happen to have the advantage of having a Second Amendment, but the Second Amendment doesn't give us our right to keep and bear arms. It protects our right to keep and bear arms, which we derive from being human beings created by God and given the responsibility of protecting life. And that's where guns come in. And the Second Amendment, by the way, just to be sure folks understand how we look at it at Gun Owners of America, the Second Amendment doesn't really deal with self-defense or with certainly much less even recreation. It has to do with making sure there's a lot of guns pointed at our employees called the government officials. It is one of the ways the founders wanted to make sure that we, the people, had the means to control what our employees are doing. Frankly, I think the protection, self-protection benefits that we have from guns, recreational opportunities they afford, that's in the Ninth Amendment. That's where the unenumerated rights are. The Second Amendment is dealing with keeping government inside the limits primarily described in Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers, and when it goes beyond that, we the people are supposed to say, stop, enough, go back. And if you don't, Jeff is cheap. Well, hopefully it doesn't come to what we had to do to George III, but that's why we have our guns.
Right. This is a big problem with, for instance, what happened with the left right now, because the left, as of late, as you are perfectly well aware of, Larry, and so is everybody at Gun Owners of America, they really have been harping on the gun issue within the last several weeks because of, lo and behold, the shootings that transpired at the AMC Theatre in Aurora, Colorado, which is the thrust of what I wanted to get into today. And what happened, as far as I'm concerned, is, well, they say that, we need more regulations. We need more gun laws on the books. Whereas, another conservatives disappointingly say, well, we don't need new gun laws. We just need to enforce the ones that we already have. And this is a typical.
What we need to do is to get rid of the ones that we already have. That theater was permitted by law to declare itself a no-gun zone.
Right.
It had a prominent sign as you entered, no guns in this establishment. And they, however, are not willing to come forward and say, okay, we should have been strictly liable, and for the 12 people killed and for the 30, 40, whatever other people wounded, some seriously, we'll take complete financial responsibility for that. No, they didn't even provide so much as a cop. That's only on Friday nights, and this was early Friday morning after midnight. It is a dereliction of just normal responsibility to have the law allow an establishment to say no guns here. Now, admittedly, I wouldn't have to go in that theater, and if I saw that they were that stupid, I wouldn't want to patronize them. I can wait for the DVD, for goodness sakes. But there are stores, such as convenience stores and supermarkets and banks, where you really have to go in from time to time. And if they have a sign like that, I don't know how many people have told me, well, I'm going in anyway. If my gun is successfully concealed, then there's no issue. And if something happens, I'm not going to be a fish in a barrel just waiting to be shot.
I mean, it's not like, a bunch of people are going to go in there and they're asking to be John Rambo'd by some douchebag, by somebody who is, a crazed felon, if you will, who's looking to take out an entire army or an entire horde of customers in the line. In this case, well, this guy opened fire in the movie theater. He was he was protected from head to toe, and because he was wearing, the Kevlar police outfit, he was heavily protected, and not only that, but he was also carrying, if I'm not mistaken, an AR-15, and not to mention he threw in tear gas, which basically covered the entire theater, and it's hard to see who is firing and not firing. So, maybe somebody, if they had been in a theater, opened fired on the guy, maybe he would have been stunned. Maybe it would have stopped him, unless they had, say, they shot him in the head. Or I was pointing this out to my mom yesterday. Well, if they had armor-piercing bullets, and I don't know a single citizen that carries one, carries a firearm with armor-piercing bullets, then, the odds of stopping this guy probably would have been minimal at best.
Well, let me say, I've thought about this. If somebody had been carrying a .357 or a .40 caliber pistol or a .45 Colt 1911 type pistol, they arguably would not have penetrated his protective armor, but it would have, if they'd have hit center of mass, it would have broken up a couple of ribs, it would have put him on the ground, he'd have been crying for his mama, and that would have been the end of the episode. And right. As you were suggesting, even if they missed and he realizes there's return fire, well, that's not in his playbook. And the element of surprise then is no longer his. He's lost that, and it's game ours. We are then, if we're the ones who can respond, we can carry out and continue to pursue him until we neutralize him. And I really think that somebody having been properly armed, in spite of what that theater's policy was, because they're not going to do anything to protect you, so why should you do anything to obey their really lethal requirement? So I think a lot of people are coming to that conclusion. I've heard it on talk shows. People are talking this way, and I think we've decided we've had it. We're fed up. We know the government can't protect us. We're going to have to do it ourselves, and so don't tell us that we can't protect ourselves. We're just not going to accept it.
Well, that's an outstanding point you made, because even the core, a number of the left, a number of the progressives are saying, well, nobody should be carrying a firearm except a cop, a law enforcement officer. Well, gee, that's not going to go so well with the gun communities, and on top of that, it's not going to go so well for everybody who's in favor of the Second Amendment, because let's be honest here. Exactly how fast are the cops going to barge into the theater and open fire on the guy before he fires on everybody else? How likely is that going to happen? Not likely at all, even if you call 911.
From the little I've been able to learn, this went on for some 7.5 minutes before one of the gals who was able to run out of the theater pulled the alarm. And within 2 minutes, or 9.5 minutes into this thing, the cops were there. By that time, his large magazine, which this very bright guy didn't realize have a tendency to jam, was already outside, realizing game over. So the cops got there very quickly. They apparently had a substation very close by, but that wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough for the 12 that are dead and the others that are still recuperating. So the idea that somehow we're going to be protected by a gun-free zone is something that only a socialist can buy into, somebody who's so disconnected from the way the world works that they really think that is going to be something other than a criminal safe zone.
Right. And, here's the interesting thing. I mean, isn't it true that the Supreme Courts have ruled, and the other courts, that, the police are under no legal obligation to protect you?
And not only have there been cases like that in federal court, that's the law in most states. So that ahead of time the police are being held harmless, as really they should, because unless they've done something criminally negligent, somebody would say, well, why are you carrying a gun? Are you paranoid? No, it's because I can't carry a cop. Cop's too heavy.
That's a very interesting point there. But, there's been a lot said about this guy and a lot it's been said about the theater and whatnot. And, right now we're still investigating and we're still collecting facts on the case. And some of the facts are pretty much convoluting from the mainstream media. But what I find particularly interesting about this is this whole thing of why the judge sealed his records, particularly in the courtroom. I mean, particularly when he showed up, for his arraignment, the first stage of his arraignment, that is. And some people thought, well, this guy looked like he was on drugs. Looked like he was spacing out the entire time while he was in the courtroom before the judge with his attorney. And I remember, Larry, about days after the shooting transpired, I went to see The Dark Knight Rises at my local theater. And I even asked some of the employees there. They said the ticket sales for that movie went down because of the shooting. And they took a 60% hit. A 60% hit. And that and plus they even banned masks and all that because of what happened in Aurora, Colorado. I mean, they're scared. They're scared for crying out loud. So because of the theaters that have a known guns policy and, they're well within their rights to do that. But the one in Aurora, Colorado, the one that had this anti-gun policy on its property, I believe that was politically enforced by the city of Aurora and not because of the movie theater's decision. If it had been a decision of the movie theater, that would have been one thing. But if it's enforced by an ordinance and the theater has no choice but to go along with it, that's totally different.
Well, it is both, because the theater is a national chain, and apparently that is their national policy. So even if we allow for the evil law that was enacted, an ordinance in the city, because you're right, they were allowed by state law to exempt themselves from concealed carry. People cannot have a concealed carry permit and exercise it legally in the city of Aurora. Well, that's kind of like telling me, we don't want you, Larry Pratt, to be here in our city. And you know what? I'm okay with that. There's a lot of other places I can live happily, and a lot of them get it right. So why should I move into a shooting gallery when I have other plans for my life?
Right. The question now before us, and I know it's even pointing this out because I was telling my mother about this, believe it or not, that because of what happened in that theater, and this was a midnight showing, you would think that they would have some kind of security or just in case something went wrong. But
on Friday nights they do, but not Friday during the day, or Friday evening. But this was Friday morning, Thursday midnight going to Friday morning, and right. So they wouldn't have had the cop there as a normal course of action. So I don't know what's so magic about having a cop on Friday and not on Thursday, particularly when you're expecting a sold-out theater, which they had. So I think there's a lot of irresponsibility, and frankly, I don't think the law should permit an establishment that says I'm open for the public. They're not allowed rightly to discriminate against having blacks come in, and they shouldn't be allowed to say you can't bring your own self-protection in.
Right. Well, particularly if, say, a national theater chain is getting subsidies from the government, if they are getting any subsidies, but that's a whole other subject to talk about on another day. But one of the things that really gets me here is the psychiatrist, and and they were talking about this, and because of the whole gun matter. But one of the things that really gets me is if the guy was on psychotropic drugs, and there has been a causal relationship between taking a drug and committing acts of violence using a firearm, just as we had seen in Columbine years ago when Dylan Klebold was on Luvox, and it had been proven beyond doubt that he was on this medication, or the so-called medication as they're billing it. Would there be some sort of a causal correlation between, say, some kind of a psychiatric medication and the use of the gun? Or was this, or is this just an excuse to say, well, this guy couldn't have done it himself? He wasn't just plain evil. He just decided it was the medication that made him do it.
Well, it's possible that the medication might have had an injurious effect on his brain, opened him up to evil tendencies. There's certainly been an association in many of these mass murders with prescription drugs that people were taking. In fact, it's led me to the conclusion that you've got to be nuts to see a psychiatrist. Give you a medication that will seal the deal, as it were, because you can change the brain's chemistry. I didn't realize until fairly recently that one little bit of crack cocaine and your brain is for the rest of your life altered. No matter if you've been able to kick the habit, you will still have that longing, and a strong one, to go back and get some more of that crack. And so who knows what the impact of some of these other drugs that are maybe legal, but they're potent. They are mind-altering. They're supposed to be dealing with people that have physical mental problems. That's why you give somebody a medication. And maybe, just maybe, these things do things to people's mind and their ability to control themselves and to submit to normal notions of right and wrong. So it could well be that that's a factor. I wouldn't say it's the cause, because it's the human heart that is the cause of what we do, whether it's something for good or for evil. And in this case, the guy would appear to have had a vacuous enough look at the arraignment, bizarre hair. This guy's behavior, apart from the shooting, was not normal. And it just makes you wonder whether he was possessed, whether he had been on drugs. But something about this guy was, I could see him.
Something made him snap. Something made him snap, and
possibly. Yeah,
possibly, or even the psychiatrist. And this is the interesting thing that just came out, that supposedly she was, I guess she was reprimanded by the university that she was employed back in 2005, the University of Colorado, that is, because she had prescribed herself drugs, and not to mention that her name that was actually originally given out by the prosecution and the defense didn't really want to use her name when they were filing throughout this process of filing charges against this kid. The name just was surreptitiously omitted. And I'm thinking to myself, this is crazy. So why are they, why are they hiding these records from? I don't want to go into conspiracy theory land here, but it just makes.
I think it's just the arrogance of so many in government that's okay. We'll take care of this. You just keep moving along. There's nothing here to see. We're the professionals. We'll take care of it. That, at a minimum, will account for some of this behavior that you're rightly pointing to as a concerning matter. This assumption that so many in government have that they're different from us, they're special, and we're not. And we better.
They know the answers, we don't.
Thank you. That's exactly the attitude that I see in them. And Lord willing, this election is going to be all about telling them, do you need a hearing aid now? Can you hear us?
Right. This is here's an interesting thing that came out. Reason Magazine came out with a very interesting piece on this. Apparently, and this came out actually yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. Apparently, and this was even out on NPR, that Chris Cox of the National Rifle Association. Now, I used to at one point like the NRA. My problem with the NRA is that it's compromised to the point where it might as well be a cousin of handgun control rather than a principal premier pro-gun organization, if you will. And the case in point here is where they decided to go after this Republican congressional candidate by the name of Debra Maggart. And I guess they were putting up, he even admitted, Chris Cox, the head of the NRA's lobbying arm, they were putting up ads and billboards, and this is from the NRA report, comparing Debra Maggart to Barack Obama. That's because while both say they support our Second Amendment rights, they both work against our freedoms behind closed doors. And the reason being is, well, apparently she was trying to block an effort by the NRA to go after companies that pretty much would not allow employees to carry firearms in their cars while on company property, saying that it's all about private property rights and liberty, and not and that the NRA is using gun rights as a justification to basically squelch their private property rights and their liberty. What do you say to that?
Well, again, if the place says that they're going to be open to the public, and that's what a parking lot is at a company, anybody from the public as well as employees can drive in there, and they say that you can't have a gun even in your car, I think that's quite an overreach. They can go further than that in some states and try to prohibit the actual possession of the firearm in the workplace itself. And frankly, I don't go for that either. If the place is open to the public, unless they're making us go through a metal detector and are providing armed security at that point and throughout the building, then let's get real. My life is worth more than their property. And especially if they're open to the public, I don't know who else is going in there. And evidently, they don't either. And evidently, they don't care.
Right.
See, what it is their lawyers advice to them that you can avoid legal liability if you say no guns. And then if somebody has a gun, well, we told them not to have one, so we're not liable. I don't see that going to work too well for the folks at the theater in Aurora. I think they're going to get sued heavily, and I hope, frankly, they get sued enough it puts them out of business.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very logical argument to make because, well, one of the points I think that was made by Brian Doherty of Reason, and I understand the point they're trying to make, they were trying to make the point here that Roger Pilon at the CATO Institute, he was pointing out that the Second Amendment prevents the government, not private parties, from infringing your right to keep and bear arms. If a private party can ban you from his property for any reason, good or bad, he can do so for carrying a gun. So, too, with the First Amendment, it limits. Well, that's true if you were, say, if it was in your home, or if it were, not a company getting subsidies, or if your company was not, a very private business.
To the public. Let's assume that I've got an architectural firm, and I'm always, when I'm with a client, at his location, and the public does not come in. Maybe I even have a buzzer on the door so that I control who comes in. Okay, if the nut jobs in that operation want to sit there unarmed, then I think you've made a case that they have taken some sort of reasonable means to enforce their nuttery. Too bad when they leave that office, what are they going to do on the way to the car? Any guarantees there, are we? But nevertheless, I can see, okay, those are somewhat reasonable steps to take to ensure that everybody is on the same playing field inside the office. But when I go into a public establishment, a supermarket, a bank, and it says no guns, who are they kidding?
Right. Well, this is a thing where, not that the NRA has been very consistent on this, and you guys have been heavily consistent, and that's why I'm, proud of you guys for, carrying the torch, whereas the NRA has consistently failed on a lot of stuff. But, what's really disappointing is that even Reason's taking this Republican Congress, this congressional candidate's side, and so is CATO. But then again, we're talking about CATO Institute that's being funded by the Koch brothers. That's not consistently libertarian. I mean, they're not exactly libertarians to the teeth. But I think that's a very excellent point you made. I'm sorry, but my life is more important than your private property. And if I'm coming into your business, well, then you better have armed security that's in case a nut job does show up. Otherwise, there's going to be a potential grounds for a lawsuit. And that's exactly what's going to happen with the AMC Theatre situation in Aurora, Colorado. I think the 12 victims who were killed because they had an anti-gun policy, guess what? There's going to be a grounds for a lawsuit against them. And and that's the problem. You want a lawsuit? If you want to pay out billions of dollars, or millions of dollars, if you will, to those families after court costs and attorney fees, go right ahead. But I think you're committing economic and financial suicide by doing that.
Now, in addition to that, I think where our discussion is heading is that at the state level particularly, but also at the federal level, we've got to work to get rid of laws enabling or requiring places to be gun-free. The idea that a school should be gun-free is absolutely lethal. All but one of our mass murders since we've had gun-free zones in the early 90s has taken place at a gun-free zone. And the one that took place that was the exception might as well have been a gun-free zone because it was at the Democrat Congresswoman's town hall where, except for the judge that was killed, I think probably most everybody else there was a Democrat. So it was and for practical purposes, it was a gun-free zone. But the others, by law and or policy, were gun-free zones. And do we think we see a pattern here? Maybe we should draw some conclusions.
Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying here. You guys, I guess, what has your thoughts been about the NRA overall? I mean,
well, they were founded for a different reason than was Gun Owners of America. They were founded following the war between the states by Union officers who were very concerned that the oftentimes Irish immigrants who had no experience with firearms, they were city boys wherever they had come from, really weren't very good shots, and these southern guys could shoot a squirrel jumping out of a tree to another tree. So they were very much literally outgunned because of the gun owner experience that mostly rural Southerners had had. And so the NRA was set up as a way of promoting familiarity with firearms to help the government out. They only in the 60s and 70s began to get pushed by their membership that, hey, got to fight back against these gun control laws that they're pouring out on us. This has got to stop. And so in response to their membership, they sort of kind of got into that position, but they were never really comfortable being an adversary to the government. And to this day, they are the mechanism by which surplus firearms are made available to the American public, the DCM program, which they've operated.
Right.
Gun Owners of America, on the other hand, was founded to oppose the government and to rip out every single gun law in the country, starting at the federal level especially.
Like the Gun Control Act of 1968, for crying out loud. I mean, that law has been on the books for decades, since it was signed into law by the Nixon administration, if I'm not mistaken, and or was it Johnson?
Nixon did his own damage. He wanted to ban handguns, so he was no prince. But this one would have been, yes, I think it was Johnson. No. Well, let's put it this way: the ATF was established in '72 by administrative decree of Richard Nixon. So you can't say that party affiliation tells you anything. All it tells you is party affiliation. It doesn't really go beyond that.
Right. You know, and that's the thing. That's the reason why I would never to this day join the NRA. But I've been looking forward to renewing my membership with you guys, because you guys have been the premier lobbying arm of, securing gun rights for everybody. And
if folks want to take you up on what you're suggesting, the easiest way to do that is to go to gunowners.org. And if folks, actually, they don't even have to join. They can get on our alert list right there on that from that main page. And typically weekly, we'll send out an alert that advises about things going on in Capitol Hill. We'll embed an email in that alert that can be sent off to the appropriate member of Congress. And that's the way Gun Owners of America makes its presence known on the Hill. It's one thing that we'll have some suits up on the Hill. That's fine. Others do too. But our guys keep nagging at them and nudging. And so they know we're an ever-present body that they need to deal with. And we keep reminding them that this is an issue that's very important to a significant part of their constituency.
Well, let me ask you this, and since I haven't looked at, and I'm sure you guys have grades for a lot of the Tea Party Republicans who are, on their position on gun rights, but
we do.
What are some of the prominent grades for some of the top Republican congressmen as far as the Second Amendment is concerned? I mean, like Eric Cantor or John Boehner, or even in this case, we're talking about Mitt Romney, considering, he seems to be the perennial favorite among the top Republicans there.
Well, the only thing that you can say in favor of Mitt Romney is that his socialism isn't in his DNA. I think he's been reactive for most of his political life. He's not the committed small-c communist that the president is. And I say that advisedly because the president actually taught at self-described small-c communist Industrial Areas Foundation, that's founded by Saul Alinsky. And the left, I'm sorry to say, is much more particular about who they retain. They understand that people are policy. And too often, those of us right of center don't take that into consideration as much as we should. So the president taught at this Alinsky-founded foundation. That means we're dealing with a guy who, among other things, believes that you and I should not have a gun because he belongs to the ruling class. He was ordained to run the socialist experiment in this country. Right. And like every other socialist experiment there's ever been, they have to first begin by destroying what's there before, and then they try to construct their totalitarian philosophy on top of the ruins of, in this case, what is a constitutional republic, which the president obviously doesn't care a whit about.
Well, like, for example, Justin Amash, who is from my state, if I'm not mistaken, he from District 3, he gets an A rating But Candace Miller gets a B rating. She's my congresswoman here. And what's kind of disappointing about her is that, oh, well, she generally leans your way, but she takes this anti-gun measure that goes for the globe. I mean, I remember back in the around 2004, when Gary Nolan was running on the Libertarian Party ticket, and he was on the road to the White House on C-SPAN, and he was fielding questions during his campaign. It was in October of 2003 at that point. And he made the point that, it's hypocritical when Republicans say they're pro-gun domestically, but they're anti-gun because they want to impose gun control on, say, countries like Iran or what have you, because they don't want them to have weapons. They don't want to have the people there to have weapons and whatnot. So what do you say to that? I mean, isn't that
like we don't understand our own history? We don't understand something very fundamental about the relationship between the people and the employees they've hired to run the government. They're assuming a statist philosophy is what ought to be imposed in these situations. And all it's going to do is then change the dictator from the one you got rid of to whoever you're going to install. And if you can't make the government afraid of the people, then the government will do whatever it wants. Maybe not right away, but over time, as ours has been doing, it will continue to amass more and more power into its hands, taken from the employer, we the people, doing things that are not permitted within this limited scope laid out in Article 1, Section 8 for the Congress to do and the federal government to do. And so if we can't get our employees to understand that, we desperately need to fire them and try somebody else out, see if they get the point. By the way, I can see that you might have been looking at the GOA rating.
I have.
Gunowners.org. Then it's right there under the Congress section, and you can select the ratings for the House of Representatives. And the way we do this is particularly important. If somebody is not an incumbent, we will ask them to fill out a questionnaire. If they have been in office before, we will endeavor to find out what they did on key freedom issues, in particular, of course, Second Amendment issues. And the ratings, once they're in office, will almost be exclusively determined by what they've done in office. Their votes, if they're really good, they might even get an A+ because they took leadership, they introduced legislation, they promoted legislation. If they get an F- like Carolyn McCarthy, it's because she also introduces legislation. It's just that it's the wrong kind of legislation. And so the grades, we try to be pretty much by the numbers. And just because somebody's an incumbent doesn't mean that we're going to give them a slightly better grade, which is something the NRA tries to do because, well, we got to work with them. So, we don't want them to be mad at us. Well, frankly, I don't want them to be mad at us. I want them to be afraid of us.
Right. It's interesting. Bill O'Reilly had, if I'm not mistaken, he had a congressman on his show about, I think it was about a week ago, or just around the time when, I think it was some days after the shootings took place. And he basically said, you know what, we should have, mandatory reporting of gun sales to the FBI. And there should be regulations on that by the federal government. But the point, Bill, is that there's already a law that enacts that. We already have that.
A lot of times people who pop off about the gun control we need are very ignorant about the gun control we have. And O'Reilly was showing that even though he opines against bloviating, he can bloviate with the best of them.
Oh, he's very good at it. And one of the things that really concerns me here is some of the bills that are coming in through, and one of the bills would, like for example, Jackson Lee, HR 227. And this is very, very scary. Can you tell us exactly what that bill is all about?
Not familiar with it by the number.
But it would amend 18 U.S.C. 922X, making it difficult to legally teach your kids the safe and effective use of firearms by extending the subsections labyrinthine provisions concerning handguns to semi-autos and semi-auto clips and to persons less than 21 rather than 18.
This is something that the anti-gun crowd has sought for quite a long time. It was in the mega anti-gun omnibus bill that Clinton was pushing after his semi-auto ban. There was an effort to go even further, and one of the elements of that omnibus anti-Second Amendment bill was a prohibition on anyone under 21 even having in their hands a semi-automatic rifle, a.k.a. assault weapon. They do not want us to be able to communicate firearms training, firearms handling, firearms use to the next generation. They want to make it so that the young person would go as long as they think they can get away with it. So they would actually have made it so that you could vote at 18, you could drink at 18, and a lot more people die because of drinking, I might point out, than have a gun at 18. You couldn't have had those firearms that they were after in your hands until you were 21. So her response is very typical. It's the same as the zero tolerance policy in the schools, that if a child even so much as draws a stick figure with a handgun in it and says, well, yeah, that's my daddy protecting me, doesn't matter. That kid's out of school for a while or whatever. Of course, that's the best thing that could happen. If that's the way those teachers are thinking in that school, you ought to have your kid out of that school.
Right.
You ought to be able to have a voucher so you can go to a school where they screw their head on right.
Right. Here's another situation that's been coming out as of late, and this has been, and I've heard about this, and I did some reading and some research on this, which is apparently the UN tried to slap an arms trade treaty on the United States, effectively rendering our Second Amendment null and void, pretty much. And this is a very big concern that had been going on for a while, but apparently the UN dropped the ball on this. Can you tell us exactly what this treaty entailed and what the specifics were?
Well, ultimately, the United States balked because for our representatives and Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, to have gotten what was being insisted upon by the other countries, they would have had their head handed to them in the election. We had a successful enough uprising by we the people, and certainly Gun Owners of America was completely all in to get as many people as possible, contacting their senators, tell them, don't even think about even considering such a treaty that would violate the Second Amendment. Because a treaty is not the supreme law of the land unless, you can go read this in the Constitution, it is made under the authority of the United States. Now, the authority of the United States is not plenary. Hillary Clinton can't say, I think I'm going to require that the Capitol be located on the moon or something like that. No, it has to be under the authority of the United States. And clearly, gun control is not under the authority of the United States. Because of the Second Amendment and, frankly, because of the 10th Amendment, it's off the table. And those laws that are on the table right now shouldn't be there at all. And so they began to hear so much backlash from their voters in the United States Senate. They just communicated to Hillary Clinton and said, maybe not this close to an election. We shouldn't be doing something like this. And so we dropped it as a result of that pressure. So if you were one of those that contacted your senator, pat yourselves on the back because you took care of business. Right.
And the question is this going to be reintroduced at some future point? And if so, what can we do to actually prevent this from being ever fully realized?
Well, I'm sure it will be back like a bad penny. It's going to keep turning up. And we're going to have to be eternally vigilant. We're going to have to be aware that our employees are always likely, if we're not watching, they're going to carry out a coup d'etat, and they're going to grab power they're not entitled to have. When they talk about us being anarchic because we want to be able to protect ourselves, excuse me, anarchy is when the government goes beyond the limits it's been given to operate within. And there is such a misunderstanding on the part of those in government that somehow I got elected, and as the president told some Republicans on one of the rare occasions when he met with anybody other than his dearly beloved Valerie Jarrett, his Rasputin, if you will, well, I won, as if that means he can do anything he wants. Well, yeah, we know you won the election, but you won the election as president of a constitutional republic, which says you can't do all that much, really.
Right. I guess this goes into actually a couple more questions, and then we'll just wrap it up here. But one question stands out is regarding what happened in Aurora, Colorado. What do you think is going to be the outcome of the shooter? And what's going to happen as a result? Is the city council going to double down on its anti-gun policy at the ordinance level further by slapping on more restrictions? I mean, exactly how many times can you repeat the same old restrictions without realizing that these restrictions are just basically copies of the same ones that you've had before?
Well, I'm not sure that the elected in Aurora get it, and who knows, they might even be as nutty as what you're suggesting. But I think statewide in Colorado, it's at least possible that the legal authority they've given unconstitutionally to a locality to have an anti-concealed carry policy. You may have a concealed carry permit from the state of Colorado, but you can't use it here in Aurora. That's actually their ordinance. That, I think, could be dealt with at the state legislature where there's somewhat more sanity.
Right.
And a legislation could be enacted saying no subdivision of this state may prohibit the lawful carrying of a firearm.
Right.
That would take care of business.
I guess before we get to the final question here, are you surprised with what happened regarding, because you mentioned this earlier on in the show, about the Fast and Furious controversy that resulted in, Eric Holder having knowledge of what was going on, but he pretty much refused to answer any questions, and he was trying to dodge every single aspect of this entire charade. I mean, are you surprised this happened?
I think Eric Holder has a very nasty choice in front of him. And either one means he's going to go to jail. The only choice is going to be for how long. If he is found in contempt of court, which could happen, and maybe even before the election, on the civil complaint being filed by the House of Representatives, then he'll either have to produce the documents or go to jail. And my guess is that if he's given that assignment, he would rather be found in contempt of court and be jailed for perhaps a few months rather than turn over the documents, which we're beginning to think would show that he ought to be in jail for lifetimes. So obviously, those might be his choices, and I guess if I were in his shoes, I'd choose a few months over a few lifetimes.
Right. Do you? What is the? My final question to you is, what is the hope that we have for the future of the United States as far as the Second Amendment and gun rights are concerned? Do you think we'll be able to get all of these laws repealed in our lifetime?
I think we're going to start working on it even after this coming election. I have seen enough that's gone on in these Republican primaries, and with the nomination of a guy like Steve Stockman in Texas, who was here once before until his district was taken away from him. But Stockman's going to be in for at least the next 8 years, Lord willing. And he's now the nominee in a district that's 70% Republican. The likelihood of him losing is not that great, especially if he can pay off his initial campaign debt.
Right.
But this guy is willing to take on the leadership. I saw him do it when he was here with the class of '94, and he hadn't gotten any sweeter since then.
Oh, I totally agree. And by the way, for those who are listening, since that was the final question, one comment from me is, let's get rid of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, because they're the enemies of not just freedom in general, but they're also the enemies of our rights to bear arms, no matter what. Thank you so much, Larry, for appearing on the show today. You've been a great
support. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no problem. You're always welcome to come back as a panelist at some point in the future. So we'll invite you back on, no matter what.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Take it easy.
Bye-bye.
And that's it for our show today. Everybody, thank you very much for tuning in, and have a good night and good afternoon. Enjoy this weekend. See you tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with our show As It Is. Later.